3 men crossed a desert to deliver 3 gifts to a newborn: gold, myrrh, and frankincense. For 2,000 years, we called these gifts symbolic, ceremonial, prophetic, rich in meaning. But here is what nobody told you. In 2008, a pharmacologist at Hebrew University in Jerusalem ran a series of tests on the active compound inside frankincense resin. His name was Arieh Moussaieff. What he found stopped his team cold. The compound activated specific ion channels in the brain, channels directly linked to anxiety reduction, to emotional regulation, to states that, in his words, could only be described as antidepressant. Now ask yourself the question nobody in Sunday school ever asked. Why would 3 scholars, men who studied the stars and the ancient texts, travel hundreds of miles to bring that specific substance to a newborn baby? Not wine, not olive oil, not cedar wood, frankincense. What did the Magi know that we have spent 2,000 years ignoring? That is what this investigation is about. The plant, Boswellia sacra. That is the tree. It grows in one place on Earth, the Dhofar region of Oman, parts of Yemen and northern Somalia. Nowhere else. It is a stubborn, strange-looking tree. It grows out of bare limestone rock, almost no soil, almost no water. And when you cut the bark, it bleeds. The resin that comes out is called olibanum, in Hebrew, lavona. The root of the name means white. The Greeks called it frankincense, from the Old French franc incense, pure incense. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. This tree is not native to Palestine, not native to Egypt, not native to anywhere near Bethlehem. The closest grove is 2,400 miles away, on foot by camel caravan across one of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The Magi did not stop at the local market. Someone made a deliberate decision to source this specific resin from the only region that produces it. Why? Boswellia sacra resin contains over 200 identified chemical compounds. But one compound does something the others do not. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. The hidden compound. The compound is called Incensole acetate. It is found exclusively in the resin of Boswellia species. And in 2008, Arieh Moussaieff at Hebrew University ran the first systematic study of what it actually does inside a living brain. His team administered Incensole acetate to mice. Then they tracked the neurological response with the precision of a pharmacology lab. What they found was published in the FASEB Journal that same year. Incensole acetate activates TRPV3 ion channels. TRPV3 channels are found throughout the brain, including the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus handles memory formation. The amygdala processes fear and threat responses. These are not peripheral regions. These are the command centers of emotional experience. When TRPV3 channels are activated by Incensole acetate, the brain produces measurable anxiolytic effects. Anxiety drops, emotional regulation improves. The researchers described the result as antidepressant-like activity. Moussaieff went further. He noted that this activation pathway is completely distinct from the mechanisms of pharmaceutical antidepressants. It does not work like Prozac. It does not work like Valium. It works through a channel that was essentially ignored by Western pharmacology until his team identified it. Read the conclusion of his paper carefully. Moussaieff's team wrote that Incensole acetate activates ion channels in the brain that provide a possible explanation for the ancient religious practice of burning incense. 2,000 years of temple worship and a 2008 neuroscience paper is now telling us there was a measurable neurological purpose behind every single one of those rituals. God dictated to Moses the exact formula for the temple incense in Exodus 30, verse 34. Stacte, onycha, galbanum, and frankincense. 4 ingredients. Specific quantities. Burned twice daily. Every single day. Without exception. Every person who entered the temple was breathing Incensole acetate. Every priest, every worshiper, every king who came to pray. For generations. In 2020, researchers confirmed what Moussaieff found. Inhalation of frankincense smoke produces psychoactive effects through a neurological pathway that is distinct from any known pharmaceutical mechanism. It is not placebo. It is not tradition. It is chemistry. Think about what you just heard. The daily neurological state of everyone who worshipped in that temple was being actively modulated by the smoke they were breathing. The altar was not just an altar, it was a delivery mechanism. God built the pharmacy into the architecture of worship. The road less traveled. Now let us talk about how it got there. Boswellia sacra grows in Dhofar. Jerusalem sits 2,400 miles to the northwest. That distance does not cross gentle terrain. It crosses the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, one of the largest and most unforgiving sand deserts on the planet. The Incense Road was the trade artery that made this journey possible. It ran from the Dhofar coast, north through the Arabian Peninsula, through the Nabatean city of Petra, and finally into Gaza, Egypt, and Jerusalem. This was not an informal path. It was a controlled, taxed, militarily protected commercial highway. Pliny the Elder documented this route in his Natural History, written around 77 CE. He described the Nabatean kingdom as the gatekeepers of the entire frankincense trade. No frankincense moved to the Mediterranean world without passing through Petra and paying the Nabatean toll. Pliny recorded the price in detail. At every checkpoint along the route, a tax was levied. Caravan handlers, water suppliers, city gatekeepers, priests who blessed the shipment. Each one added a cost. By the time frankincense reached Rome, it was worth more than its weight in silver. In 1st century Palestine, a single pound of high-quality Boswellia sacra resin cost more than a laborer earned in a week. Let that sink in. A laborer's weekly wage for a single pound. And Nicodemus, in John 19:39, will later bring 75 pounds of aloe and myrrh to Jesus' tomb. That detail alone tells you something about the wealth and the intention behind these gifts. I want you to hold that image for a moment. 3 scholars arrive at a stable in Bethlehem, carrying a substance that crossed 2,400 miles of desert. A substance no local merchant could source. A substance that required advanced planning, significant wealth, and access to a trade network most ordinary people in 1st century Palestine had never touched. This was not a last-minute gift. Whoever sent the Magi knew exactly what they were bringing, and exactly why. The discovery. Here is where the investigation changes. In 2020, archaeologists excavating Tel Arad in Israel's Negev desert made a discovery that rewrote what we thought we knew about ancient Israelite worship. They found 2 limestone altars inside a Judahite temple. The altars dated to the 8th century BCE, over 2,800 years old. Lead archaeologist Arie, working with the Israel Antiquities Authority, ran chemical analysis on residue still present on those altar surfaces. One altar tested positive for cannabis, the other tested positive for frankincense. This was the first physical, chemical evidence of frankincense being burned in an ancient Israelite place of worship. Not a written claim, not a tradition passed down through rabbinical texts. Physical residue, on stone, 2,800 years old. Confirmed by chemical analysis. Published in the Tel Aviv Journal of the Institute of Archaeology. This is the moment the investigation changes its frame entirely. For centuries, we read Exodus 30 as a liturgical text. God gave Moses a recipe for incense. The priests burned it. The smoke rose to heaven. It was spiritual, symbolic, beautiful. But the Tel Arad evidence forces a different question. What if the temple was not just a place of worship? What if it was, simultaneously, a neurological environment? Purpose-built, chemically calibrated, designed to produce a specific cognitive state in every person who entered. Leviticus 2 verses 1 and 2 describes frankincense placed on every grain offering brought to the temple. Not sometimes, every single one. Every worshiper who brought an offering was activating TRPV3 ion channels in the brain of every priest who received it. Isaiah 60 verse 6, written centuries before the birth of Christ, describes a future king to whom all from Sheba will come, bearing gold and frankincense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord. The Magi came from the east. Sheba was in the east. They were not improvising. They were fulfilling a prophetic prescription written into the text 700 years before they arrived. The dual gift thesis. So what was the frankincense gift, really? Matthew 2:11 records 3 gifts: gold, myrrh, frankincense. Biblical scholars have long read these gifts symbolically. Gold for a king, myrrh for death and burial, frankincense for divinity. That interpretation is not wrong, but I think it is incomplete. Consider what the Magi actually were. The Greek word used in Matthew is magoi. It refers to scholars of the Persian or Babylonian tradition, men who studied astronomy, medicine, natural philosophy, and the sacred texts across multiple civilizations. These were not simple gift-bearers who grabbed something expensive from a market in Persia. They were, by the standards of their era, scientists, physicians, astronomers, readers of ancient pharmacological knowledge. They would have known the properties of every substance moving through the Nabatean trade network. They would have known what frankincense resin does when it burns in an enclosed space near a living body. Every physician in the ancient world knew that burning frankincense changed the cognitive state of those present. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who documented hundreds of medicinal plants in the 1st century CE, wrote about the properties of aromatic resins with the precision of a clinical observer. The knowledge was not secret. It was simply practiced without the vocabulary of modern neuroscience. A newborn brain is, from a neurological standpoint, the most plastic and vulnerable brain a human being ever has. It is forming neural connections at a rate that will never be replicated at any other stage of life. The emotional and sensory environment that surrounds that brain in its earliest days actively shapes the architecture it is building. Chronic anxiety in the early environment, chronic fear, chronic stress. All of these have measurable effects on how a developing brain wires itself. This is not speculation. This is 21st century developmental neuroscience. The gift of frankincense to a newborn is, through the lens of Moussaieff's 2008 finding, a gift of neurological calm, of reduced anxiety in the surrounding environment, of activated TRPV3 channels in every adult present, creating a measurably calmer space around the child being born into the world. Was that the intention? I cannot prove it was. What I can tell you is this: the men who brought it traveled 2,400 miles. They did not do that carrying something they did not understand. They understood plants and their properties at a level that most modern people, raised on pharmaceutical chemistry, have completely lost. The symbolic reading and the pharmacological reading are not in conflict. They were never in conflict. Frankincense could be a marker of divine presence and a neurologically active compound at exactly the same time. The ancient world did not separate the sacred from the scientific. They assumed those things were the same. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of gift-giving, or it is not a coincidence at all. Now here is what the investigation concludes. Frankincense is not just incense, it is a neurologically active compound used in sacred contexts across every major ancient civilization because it works. It measurably changes the brain. It measurably reduces anxiety. It measurably alters the cognitive environment of every person in the room when it burns. The God of Exodus did not choose frankincense for the temple incense formula because it smelled holy. The ancients chose it because they understood at some observable level exactly what it did. Arieh Moussaieff proved it in a laboratory in Jerusalem in 2008. Aaron Arie found the residue on a 2,800-year-old altar in the Negev desert in 2020, and 3 scholars from the East carried it across 2,400 miles of desert to the child they had been reading about in the ancient texts. The Bible is not just a spiritual document. It is, among many other things, a pharmacological record, and we are only beginning to read it that way.